we sent this stuff home with you, I believe, like last week, or at some point you've gotten these handouts. I know that you got to talk with Dennis and Mark last week, I think, was it last Thursday? And they sort of talked about the structure of child protection and what that looks like, and I'm assuming kind of how cases come into the system through centralized intake. And then Tara talked to you about kind of the legal authority that we have in Montana. And so tonight, what we want to talk to you about is what is child abuse and neglect, because I know certainly before I came into the system and started working with families and children, I knew what I thought was abusive or neglectful, and as a parent, I knew what measuring stick I was going to use to say that this parent was either good, bad, or whatever. But when you're looking at what is legally considered abuse or neglect, it's a good place to start so that you know what happened with the kiddo before they even came to your caseload, okay? And what we provided, this first sheet that you have that talks about the different codes, these are the categories that the social workers, I call them social workers, that's dating me, the child protection specialists, because they're not all social workers. The child protection specialists get their report from centralized intake, and they have put a code on it about what kind of abuse did centralized intake decide this case was based on the information they collected from the person who called in. And that and I'm just going to go through them briefly because it'll be the things we'll be covering tonight in training, and then if you have questions specific to any of these types of abuse, we can certainly talk about that, and or I can just start, we can go through, you know, what does that look like. The first one is abandonment, and there's really specific kind of criterion around what abandonment looks like. They need to basically be gone for a long period of time. So let's see, a parent leaves the child under circumstances that make it reasonable to believe that they're not going to resume care of the child in the future, or they willfully surrender that physical custody for 6 months, and then during that time they just don't even stay in contact at all. They seriously, clearly are not planning on coming back into their life, or they're unknown and have been unknown for 90 days, and reasonable efforts have been have attempted to identify them, or they can voluntarily surrender newborns. That is your Safe Haven Act. Moms who deliver babies can leave them voluntarily within the first 30 days of their life with an emergency provider, so law enforcement, fire stations, hospitals, a CPS worker, somebody who can take that child and they're not held legally accountable for that. And the purpose of that law, and it's enacted nationally, was so people weren't leaving babies in dumpsters, right? Moms get scared and do silly things, and so hopefully we can help them understand there's a way for them to walk away if they need to, or if they're fearful.
And as we kind of go through these, I want you guys to, we all think of like scenarios in our heads, but think about protective capacities of parents or caregivers other than the parents, the family members, the neighbors, the daycare providers, the vulnerability of the kids. This abandonment, like for the baby doe is obviously a newborn is very vulnerable, but also when you start thinking about a 16-year-old ungovernable child. For instance, I have one that we're considering abandonment right now because they keep getting in physical altercations, and mom's throwing her hands up and says, I will not care for her anymore. So we've taken her into custody under an abandonment because we're not going to obviously put her out there for 6 months. And then the other one that I think is really kind of different and outside of maybe what we would think about here is kids that have gone into like a residential facility for mental health work. They step down to group homes, and then I have one specifically right now that was in a group home, and we weren't able to actually take custody of her under the law until she was ready to step down, and the parents weren't going to provide for her. And it's just, it's a remarkable amount of, chaos and trauma that kids have to go through sometimes in order to meet our law. And imminent danger, I think, is the other piece of this that we really have to consider as well, is that while she's in a group home, she's okay. She's safe. There's not an imminent risk of harm. And we really have to consider that when we're applying our law to taking kids into custody. So, and just before you guys, I can't help but think, were you guys surprised at the criteria of Montana state law, and what maybe your perception of physical neglect or physical abuse was versus what Montana state law says is physical abuse? Because I have to tell you, it floors me as to, our law is quite liberal, but anyways, it's just,
When you say liberal, you mean you think that a lot of things can happen to a child
Yes.
that isn't considered abuse?
correct.
Okay.
I think that the parent's right to parent in the state of Montana is very broad. Kids sleeping on floors, dirt floors, no running water, no plumbing, not abuse, not neglect. It's a way of life for some families. It truly is. So
Poverty is not.
poverty, homelessness, living in your car is not abuse nor neglect. Very loving parents have found themselves unemployed, homeless, and but they love their kids, and that's not neglect. And it just, no kid deserves to sleep on the floor with no mattress, but that's not neglect. And so it's really,
She felt compelled to say.
I do because I think that we come across as heartless when we're like, not that bad, it's dirty, not that, but not in any way, shape, or form do we condone this. Every kid deserves the best in life, but
sleeping on the floor without a mattress, if the parents have the means to.
Correct. Yeah, you're right. And that's true. Right. Is this a form of punishment that's pretty unfair? You're right. But I guess I really go down to the poverty.
I'll comment about the dumpster scenario that you stated. You see all the time on the news that people are putting their
Still
babies in
doing
dumpsters.
it.
I don't think the people that need to know about
It's
that
a
law.
lack of education, and I'm going to be real honest and tell you that I had a mom I worked with that I encouraged her greatly to just walk away, because she was going to voluntarily give this child to somebody that was a friend of hers that we already were working with and clearly didn't need another child.
They all run together too, by the way. They all know each other. They all run together. And I'm being facetious. I can't be facetious. I know.
Don't do that.
Because they're
We're
not all
here
they.
for that.
And exactly. I do want to change that perception of the theys, but there's a handful of them. I'll still say that.
So you're right, that information needs to be out there, that's the point of it, and I don't know that there's enough education in the high schools so that girls know if you're pregnant, you're afraid, and you're not telling your parents, rather than going off and delivering and then suffocating them in your closet, putting them in, all the horror stories you read, or dumpsters, or whatever. Take this little sweet pea and drop them off with somebody who can take them, and it has to be within the 30 days for there to not be a legal accountability or recourse. And they can give their information, they're encouraged to give their information, but often they're fearful and will not.
Do the emergency services people know? They know about this law, right?
They do. They totally do.
All right, what's the difference between before 30 and after 30?
I don't know why that was picked. I think it was a matter of most parents, if you take a kiddo and you've got him in your care and you're home for 30 days, it's not the same situation as the scared teenager delivering in the
Well, yeah, I
bathroom in high
understand.
school.
That wasn't, you took the other side, you answered something.
I don't
question.
disagree with you that
No,
walking
right.
away.
In other words, a mother gives you her newborn at 4 days and
Yeah.
everything's done. 45 days, she decides, I just can't do that. Well, if she just wants to walk up and say, hey, I'm abandoning this child, isn't it about the same?
Well, I'm sure they can do that still. I don't know why there's federal requirements around a 30-day thing, and certainly we would encourage, and there's always voluntary relinquishment. Parents
what
can
I'm
always
talking about, yeah.
voluntarily relinquish their
Yeah.
children. If they have the wherewithal to have them for that length of time and then decide they don't have them, there's usually more thought that's gone into that as far as
It's not such
discussions
an
and-
emotional, maybe.
it's not based
In
on
the
I just
moment.
delivered and now I have a baby that's crying and I'm going to put
And
a
I don't
pillow
know
over
what
it
to
because my
do.
parents are going to hear this baby crying down the hall, and I can't get caught with this baby. It's this irrational thing that happens in those first few days. Probably they're not gonna be held accountable legally either if they do the abandonment with an older child. But anyone can relinquish their parental rights. Anyone could call and say, the hotline and say, I can't do it. And we would encourage, I would hope people would have the strength to do that if they knew that they could. And then there's all the information about adoption too. We have, Catholic and Lutheran social services in Montana that can provide adoption services as well. So there's other avenues. It's just that emotional first piece that they needed to come up with a way to give that education to young women about that's not your only option to kill the baby versus take it somewhere safe. Let somebody have it. So you're right. They should always be able to make that choice, and they do. And hopefully they're not held legally accountable for something if it's for the right reason. It just depends on how they do it. If they wrap it up in a blanket and they leave it outside in front of the doorstep, well, that's a 45 day. That's now we're going to be talking.
Yeah.
But they can wrap it up in a blanket and leave it in a basket at the providers and go front doorstep. Police, fire. But there's parameters around who that's okay to do that with.
But if they can't identify the parent, the mother, if she does it when the baby's 45 days old, can they identify the mother?
I don't know, it just depends on what information they had. Are there videos, or this, or that? And really there's no, I don't want to get, caught up on that piece with you. I just wanted you to know it's an option that's available to our young women. And that's what that means about they can voluntarily surrender their kiddos without any legal accountability. Did you have a question about that?
Yeah, I was interested about the running water and stuff.
I know, but people choose to live up in Stickney Creek. And
every single person.
Where
is
is
that?
Where's that?
well, have you been?
No, but I did go to Great Falls the other day and I saw the sign.
Yeah, it's outside of Craig. If you go across the Craig Bridge, it's kind of between Craig and whatever, Dearborn.
Oh,
It's kind of a traditional backwoods, very.
It's off the grid.
Yeah, it's very off the grid. It's different. It's kind of, yeah.
I've not been there, but kind of like that. Yeah, people have different kind of shelters they've put together. No, you don't want to take a field trip because the other thing is they're very anti-government and anti-people who don't belong there. So even law enforcement goes with that.
Oh yeah.
We would never go on our own to a call up Stickney Creek without law enforcement going because they've already made that clear.
Is
So
it a big area once you get back in there?
I think and it's woods. You're in the mountains in Montana.
Right.
How long have they been there?
Please don't take a trip to Stickney Creek.
No.
No,
Don't go farther than Craig.
I just
Let me
want to
just
see
say,
the sign.
yeah, you'll see the sign.
How long has it been there?
Boy, as a community, I started with the division in 2002, and it was already kind of a discussion that was being had, and I never went. It's just, it was probably a lot like, I'm trying to think of where the other community is, where the land was over towards Boulder, on the top of the hill, on the pineapple plantation is what they call it for a long time when I lived over there. It's that right hand or left hand side as you're going down in towards the valley on Boulder Hill. That was off the grid for years. It's not any longer, but it was the same kind of thing. Land was very inexpensive. People came here from other communities, had no idea really what we were dealing with for Montana winters, and that there wasn't power and that there wasn't. And then now they had the land, and it's kind of the same thing. Land was cheap. People migrated here and then realized, unless you can afford a generator and propane or whatever, that you're not going to have power, you're not going to have running water. But that is not in and of itself a neglectful situation, because as long as a child's basic needs are being met,
Yes, I grew up with that running water when I was in high school.
many people did for
Well,
years, right?
Exactly, and I think that's what we really have to focus more onto, is that the effects of it in the developing child. And even as we talk about drugs and alcohol, there's very functional alcoholics out there that care well for their kids. They do, and but they are a raging alcoholic, or they're a drug user, but their kids' needs are met. They go to their different sports. There's just, so it's really, how does it affect the development of the child? And it's so funny, when I read through this, the one thing that I really highlighted was the condition of the child. That's what you have to focus on.
And it's easy to get off task, and that's why important to understand what the laws are, because if you come into it and your assumption is that when I start working with a family and they're discussing reunification, but you know mom lives in a place or dad lives in a place that doesn't have running water and doesn't have electricity, if they're able to provide, you know, heat in the winter so they're not freezing to death, and food so that they're nourished and
This is kind of
meet their needs.
subjective in many regards, but you also gotta make sure you don't set the standard too high.
Yeah.
Right.
If you can meet your child's basic needs, they're not hungry, they're not cold, they're not, you know, being harmed physically, then that's not abuse and neglect. Might be a different standard of living than we're used to, but think about for how long nobody had running water, nobody had indoor plumbing, nobody had, you know what I mean? You were hunting and fishing and gathering to feed your family. You didn't necessarily have a grocery on the corner. So for us now, with our different lifestyles, to be judgmental of a way that other people might still be living, in Montana, for example, if they're living by the creek in their tent, whatever, that's all okay when it's summer. But now we would maybe need to do a good assessment if now it's becoming this temperature. That doesn't meet their basic needs anymore for warmth and comfort and safety. Okay, so there's just
What about education?
educational neglect is on here. It is a code that is provided in our system, and that is defined as complete failure to either enroll a school-aged child in a public or a non-public school, or complete failure to homeschool a school-aged child. And in Montana, school-aged children are between 7 and 16. And they don't have to be actually participating in a homeschool program. We can't really validate that.
Okay.
They have to be enrolled with the superintendent of schools as a homeschool kiddo. And as long as the parent has enrolled them with the superintendent of schools, then the CPS role is out of it.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that, like Tara's office maybe wouldn't, I think they charge the parents now, if they're truant for too long, they send a letter and it becomes an issue then, because the parents are being held accountable for the educational neglect, but it's not a child protection issue.
I knew that was there, it sounded to me like this Sticky Creek place was the kind of place that they wouldn't be likely sending their kids to school.
Well, and they may
So much.
not be.
But as long as they're enrolled with the superintendent of schools.
Well, or that we don't know they're there, right? I mean, seriously, how are you gonna know kids are anywhere
Okay.
until somebody makes a report?
Yeah.
Right.
Has to come through centralized intake, right? Eventually somebody has to make a referral. I'm gonna go through these first and then we'll start talking about each one, because I'm afraid that we'll get off on a tangent and we'll miss some stuff.
I can assure you we will.
Will we? Okay,
We
okay,
will.
one more thing,
Right,
I'll
that's pretty clear.
That water, do they have
Okay.
to have access
Yes.
to water
Yes, because you have to
Okay.
be able, I mean,
to be able to drink it?
yes,
Okay,
yes,
that's what I'm
yeah.
just wondering.
so gallon jugs that you've got when
Because
you
a
come
lot
to
of them don't
town.
get showered and bathed, but yet they'll get like a sponge bath or.
Sure,
Right.
sure, yep.
Or
Okay.
maybe a parent that lives out like that has made arrangements with the school so that the kiddos are doing breakfast and lunch at school, and maybe they're providing some facilities, or they can go to the Y.
Do
or-
some of our schools here that do this, do
Yep.
that?
Oh,
Sure do.
yeah,
Oh,
schools are
sweet.
pretty amazing about
Sure do.
figuring out what kids need and meeting their needs.
Good.
Yeah. We
It's
have
a
an
community effort, right? Sometimes people wanna hold a mom accountable, for example, and say, well, she should be able to feed them lunch. Well, but if we have a program at school and the child gets fed at school,
As long
At
as they're
least you
getting
know they're
fed.
getting fed.
then
Yep.
what, why would we wanna be angry at mom? The
Mhm.
community has figured it out, mom has gotten the services that she needs, and the kids are being fed, right? And they also have backpack programs now where they put together enough stuff for kids to take home over the weekend.
It's so cool.
So there's ways
It
to
is so cool.
do meet needs for
Wow.
kids, clothing, lost and found stuff gets washed, and there's lots of good stuff going on out there. Parents aren't always able to meet their children's needs, but as long as the children's needs are being met, it doesn't have to be mom feeding them if she's able to provide them a nutritious meal. Does that make sense? Okay. The death by actual or possible neglect, while it's a code in here, and we wouldn't necessarily as CPS be investigating that case about that child because there's no more safety issue. Now it's a criminal case, there might be other children in the home. And so then there has to be that assessment by CPS to how did this child die and are these other children at risk, okay? Educational neglect we just talked about. Exposure and manufacture of drugs. Exposure to drug manufacturing and distribution. That was added about the time meth exploded, probably around 2004 or 5. They had to come up with a different code, one that held parents accountable right now. Because drug use and abuse is one thing, manufacturing and distribution when children are involved is a whole different ballgame. Meth labs, for example. That's a don't pass go, don't collect $200, the children are kind of come into care and or get placed with their other parent who wasn't there, doesn't live there, isn't part of that household. These children were placed with their fathers.
How about with these providers now for the legal marijuana? And if the kids are living there? If they're,
Smoking marijuana in and of itself or any drug use in and of itself is not abuse or neglect. You have to have the connection of how is the parent's behavior causing an abusive or neglectful environment for the child. So when mom smokes pot, if she then nods off on the couch and the 2-year-old is left unattended, you can show that her use is equaling abuse or neglect. Smoking marijuana, because you have a green card, as of right now, has no impact on your, I mean, we can't just say one thing equals the other.
so they can smoke it in front of the children?
There's actually no, and we've begged for more clarification, but really as vague as the law is, we all know how vague the law is. I have to be honest, when I go out on a call, though, I consider it to sex. If you would, I mean, obviously you're not going to sit and have sex in front of your kids. You're not going to sit and smoke pot in front of your kid. They shouldn't know it happens. They shouldn't see it. They shouldn't smell it. They shouldn't hear it. They shouldn't have any idea that any such thing ever occurs. And if that's what you need to go do in your back room, in your back area, while Junior's in the crib up in the front area, I can't say that that equals abuse or neglect. But sitting and smoking in front of them, yeah. I can say that that's at least going to cause a second hand. But here's the other thing: cigarette smoke. And how about when a baby is born and they test positive for THC? Okay, well, what is actually going to be the medical safety risk to this kid that is born positive for THC? They're not going to suffer withdrawals.
It's already happened.
Well, I mean, right? I mean, if they're already licensed. No, so but then cigarettes are still legal, and so it's a really hard. I mean,
It's a legal use.
Right. I mean, you can
It's
take
not
Oxycontin
illegal,
in
it's
front of your
a
kid.
legal, yeah, you can,
So,
prescription,
yeah.
anything that's legal, parents can use around their children. And if they have the legal ability right now, here's the other thing that's behind the scenes on that, you guys, is that because clearly it's in upheaval, the division thought, why spend time, you know, there's only so many bills you're gonna wanna throw your name in the hat about with kids and families when you're going to the legislature. They knew there was gonna be some revisions and hopefully some clarification. So I think they were sort of waiting to see what happened, you know, rather than wasting a bunch of time trying to come up with what are we going to do as Child and Family Services, how is this going to impact our role with children. They were kind of waiting to see, and then that wait and see is still all of us waiting to see, because nobody
work
knows,
very well.
right? Nobody knows. So until that shakes out, there's no legal information that says. Now the only thing that we've done as a division is say to foster parents, if you need to have a green card, then you have a debilitating medical issue. If you have a debilitating medical issue, you're probably not able to provide safe care for kids. And so they've tried to, while they can't deny a license probably for green card, they can use the medical piece of it and really discuss with them, are you really physically able to care for this child if you need to be smoking marijuana? So that's a different way that they tried to work with that. Did you have something?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, I can tell, I can see.
I wasn't gonna ask the question, but since we got onto this anyway, and the distribution part in here, is distribution considered per the law, so that even if they were really only doing this is probably mean things other than marijuana, but where they were really, it was personal consumption, but they had enough on hand that law enforcement would say that the amount they could charge you with distribution, then it hits distribution for this too?
Yes, because your law, the definition is exposing a child to the criminal distribution of dangerous drugs, the criminal production or manufacture of dangerous drugs, or the operation of an unlawful clandestine laboratory. Dangerous drugs means the compounds and substances described in the dangerous drugs in Schedules 4, in Title 50, Chapter 32, Part 2. So it's a criminal thing that they would be distributing, or so if they're arrested for distribution,
Okay. That's
that
all on that.
becomes an
That's-
issue.
It's
because if kids are
basically
in
the
home.
criminal definition that you're using as well.
Yes, yes. And then there's failure to thrive, which we'll talk a little bit more about, and that is, requires a physician's diagnosis, okay, because there's organic and inorganic failure to thrive, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Medical neglect, medical neglect means that they didn't get that kiddo care that they needed and they had the means to do it. It doesn't mean, I don't have any insurance, I don't have any extra money because I live in poverty and for whatever reason my kids don't qualify for Medicaid, and I can't get them that care. That's medical neglect. So it says adequate health care for a child means medical or non-medical remedial care if such care is covered by medical insurance.
So it wouldn't be medical neglect if they didn't have the means to do it and weren't able, and thus didn't do it.
Right.
That's not medical neglect.
Right.
Even though.
And usually the medical neglect stuff is around pretty significant illnesses that kids
Okay.
need to have treatment for, or we'll get to the teeth thing here in a minute, but so for example, I had, maybe it's not in there yet, it's later.
Yeah.
Babies with bottle rot or children that have any kind of infections in their mouths, that can become a systemic issue, that brain, infection. So you can say, okay, if you don't get treatment for this, clearly there's the possibility that that's gonna impact this child's health and well-being. So then the social worker or the CPS worker's role would be to help. How can we get those services for your child?
What if they belong to a church that doesn't?
You'd be surprised how many people come out of the woodwork to help kids.
Well, no, I think she's saying, you mean for
Yeah.
religious.
Is there a
religious
religious
reason.
exclusion?
Yeah.
I think the criminal law is what we would follow there, and if a person can't be held criminally liable for something they're doing based on their religious views, and usually that comes down to, is the child gonna die if you don't provide that medical care? So cancer treatment, things like that, and then a judge has to decide. That's a judicial
I
decision.
had a call, this was years ago, of a child that was hit by a car and needed blood, and the family's religion
Oh.
said that ain't okay.
We don't believe in
And
that.
so we ended up going to the judge's house
Yeah,
with an order, and that's how we dealt with it.
yeah, because you can only, the US Constitution has a lot of protections for our privacies and our rights, but Montana has the most strong rights to privacy of any place in the United States. And so if we're gonna infringe on a parent's right to raise their child, better be because their health and well-being is at risk and at safety. So we can't just intervene or intrude on a parent without good cause, without them, once we're in there and investigating or involved, it better meet the level of intervention that we need to have, because you just don't get to go and infringe on someone's right to parent. None of us would have wanted somebody to be telling us how to do it. We all had a mother or mother-in-law that did that, right?
I would have taken some advice a few times.
I know, right? Not that we didn't need advice. I'm just saying we would get defensive maybe, so.
On that medical neglect, I think that one of the things that we really need to kind of take into appreciation as well is that Lewis and Clark County is ungodly large. And we're talking Lincoln, Augusta, the Dearborn, that's where that cutoff is too, by the way, down to, Jefferson. So we do the 4 counties here, but we just, for CASA, it's just here in Broadwater.
And Mar.
Yeah.
Oh,
Lewis
you
and
got
Clark
too?
So, okay, Lewis and Clark, Broadwater, and Mar. So let's talk about Mar a little bit, okay? Huge. So, although White Sulphur Springs has, it's a medical facility, I won't use any adjectives.
clinic?
It's a clinic. What about a uncontrolled diabetic that is going to a dietitian, that it regularly checks their sugars, but they are an uncontrolled diabetic? and they can go into shock and comatose at any given time. And you're still an hour and a half outside of White Sulphur Springs, which means that you're a good 2.5 from Great Falls, which means you're way out of Helena, and you wouldn't even come here anyways. So, so you really have to kind of start to take into appreciation their right to live where they want to live. And although I don't think it's a good idea that you live way up in the boonies and you have a really fragile kid, that's not my choice. And that imminent danger, yes, it could happen. Yes, mom, yes, it could happen. But that right to privacy and that right to live where you want and that right to, they have access and they're doing what they can to control it, but it's just.
But on the same side of that, we have had a case where a child was terminated. Her
Yes.
mother's rights were terminated for her solely in a sibling set of 3 because she had diabetes and was of an age where she was able to control it herself, but she also knew what to do to skew it, to make herself sick. And I think there was a lot of positive reinforcement for that, because when I'm not taking my medication and I get really sick, I go to the emergency room and I'm in the hospital, and those nurses are so cool to me, and I get this and I get this, and so it was kind of reinforcing for her to make herself sick. And she was maybe 10 or 11 at the time when we started working with her. Mom just didn't have the capabilities to really hold that kiddo accountable in a way that was going to keep her safe. And even when we had her in foster care, there were times where I would have her on a visit with her mom, and the next thing you know, she'd be crashing because she'd either ingested sugar that we didn't know about, or she had given herself too much insulin we didn't know about. I mean, she would swing from one end to the other, and it was really meaning she was going to go into a coma at some point. This was just not going to work if she lived in that mom's house because she couldn't manage her. So while mom probably wasn't being neglectful, her lack of faculties and capabilities certainly meant this child couldn't go home, and she didn't go home. But the other 2 children were fine.
They didn't have any help.
They didn't have a health issue that mom couldn't manage. Yeah. So it's tough. It's not easy ever when we're having to look at whether we would terminate a crown right. That's huge. That's the very last thing anybody wants to do. All right. The other thing on here is physical neglect. That's what we were talking earlier about, those elements. So failure to provide basic necessities, including but not limited to appropriate and adequate nutrition, protective shelter from the elements, appropriate clothing related to the weather conditions, or failure to provide cleanliness and general supervision, or both, or exposing or allowing a child to be exposed to an unreasonable physical or psychological risk to the child. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about neglect. That's the biggest one.
You can go on and on about
You got
neglect.
pages and pages about neglect, right? Physical abuse is the easy one. I hate to say that, but it's the one where there's not much I can tell you. If they're physically abused, there's evidence to support that. There's an injury that supports that. Okay, so that's, in Montana, it says an intentional act or an intentional omission or gross negligence that would result in substantial skin bruising, which substantial skin bruising is tough. That's kind of subjective depending who's looking at it or thinking about it. But, when I think of substantial skin bruising, I don't think, a swat that might have left a little mark on their butt. And we're talking substantial skin bruising in my mind. It's black, it's clear that there was a physical force behind it that caused it, okay? So physical abuse is one of those things that's tough. Internal bleeding, substantial injury to skin, subdural hematoma, burns, bone fractures, extreme pain, permanent or temporary disfigurement, impairment of any bodily organ or function, or causing their death. So physical abuse is one of those where, sadly, that's the easy case to know, did it or didn't it. Is it or isn't it abuse? Because you can see it. Physical neglect, you can't see.
But a lot of people also want to make either isolated incidents or, I guess I'm going to call it like a reactionary incident. Kid calls mom a B, mom turns around and slaps him. I don't know that I wouldn't maybe do the same thing, but I mean, it's all in context. It's all, but is that the first time or is that the 10th time? And what do you do to remediate that? So it's all, and so, well, that's abuse. Well, I can understand and I can't condone the hitting, but what do you do when the kid slaps the mom too? That's kind of abuse too, but we're not going to call the police.
Discipline your children. And it's
Exactly.
not against the law to use corporal punishment. It is against our laws to leave marks or significant injuries or significant bruising.
So it's a gray area. You spank with a wet hand versus a dry hand, and I tell you, you've got a different story on your hands. I kid you not. I mean, it's remarkable how much different a wet hand.
You're kidding.
Yep.
Wet hand is.
Yep, it just increases that contact, and I
Oh.
don't know why.
I'll be darned.
Yeah, so
And when you're in the field and you're talking with parents who have strong beliefs about spanking and corporal punishment, you have the discussion around not using an implement, right? If I'm using an implement to spank my child, I really don't know what force I'm using. If I'm using my hand and it hurts my hand, I'm pretty sure it hurts that kiddo, right? And so you have to think about, and we do a lot of education around what is discipline versus what is punishment. Because punishment is what leads to physical abuse. Discipline is what we would all hope that parents are providing their child, boundaries, discipline.
In my day and age growing up, man,
yeah.
You got one?
there's been a lot of abuse.
I'm a thinking that I got swatted a few times myself.
Just
I mean,
And that's the other thing that we
parents
face.
used belts in my
Yeah.
day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it did leave a mark, right?
Oh.
But now that's the discussion we have to have is, with the evolution of everything comes when you know better, you do better. And what we know now is, that's against the law. Children have rights too. You don't get to leave bruises and marks on children because they made you mad.
So do you get a lot of cases where the let's say teenagers, or even 10-year-olds, their behavior is is pretty much out of control where they are, like you say, hitting the parents, throwing stuff at the parents?
Really, then it's assault on a parent. I mean, it's a part
Well,
of
and if a
family.
parent does something in self-defense,
Yeah,
and you
that's
Yeah.
restrains a child or, reacts if they have an injury and this child's coming at me with something. I mean, self-defense is a different situation. This is that intentional act or gross omission that's causing this to happen versus whatever. And that's the point of the investigation. See, that's
It really
the other
is.
thing. And I just have to say really quickly, we have come from a system of abuse was determined by incident driven. So I got a referral that somebody had an injury. My job was to go out and investigate, law enforcement terminology. Did it happen or didn't it happen? And I was pretty much looking